All right, here's another short story, a longer one. It is called In the Dragon's House by Orson Scott Card. In a fit of romantic excess, the builder of the house at 22 Adams gave this lovely street of grand Victorian mansions its one mark of distinction, a Gothic cathedral of a house, complete with turrets, crenellated battlements, steep pitched roofs, and even gargoyles as downspouts. One of the gargoyles, the one most easily visible to those who approached the front door, was a fierce dragon's head. In a thunderstorm, the beast spewed great gouts of water, for it collected from the largest expanse of the roofs. But this wet Wyrm was no less to be avoided than its mythical fire-breathing forebears. Inside the house, however, there was no attempt to be archaic or fey. Electricity was in the house from the beginning. In fact, it was the first house in Mayfield to be fully wired during construction, and the owner spared no expense. Knobs and wires were concealed behind the lathes, and every room of any size had not just one electric outlet, but 4, one in each wall. A shameless extravagance, for what could anyone ever need so many outlets for? As the house was going up, passerbys were known to tut-tut that the house was doomed to burn, having so much fire running up and down inside the walls. But the house did not burn, while others, less well-wired, sometimes did, as their owners overloaded circuits with multipliers and extension cords to make up for the electrical deficiency. Between the gargoyle and the rumors of furniture fire, it was inevitable that the houses would call it the Dragon House, or the neighbors would call it the Dragon House. During the 1920s, the moniker changed a little, becoming the Old Dragon's House, for during that time the owner was an old widower, the son of the original builder, who valued his privacy and had no concern for what the neighbors thought. He let the small gardens surrounding the house go utterly to seed, so it was soon a jungle of tall weeds that offended the eye and endlessly seeded the neighbors' gardens. When helpful or impatient neighbors came over from time to time and mowed the garden, the old man met them with hostility. As he grew older and more isolated, he threatened violence, first with a broom, then with a rake, and then finally with a cane, which might have been pathetic in the hands of such an old man, but he was so fiery in his wrath that even the boldest man quailed before him, and he soon became known among the neighbors as the Old Dragon. It was from him, as much as from the gargoyle, that the house seemed to derive its name. Finally, the neighbors went to court and got an injunction compelling the old man to control the weeds on his property. The Old Dragon responded by hiring workmen to come and pave the entire garden, front and back, with bricks and cobblestones, so that the only living things in the yard were the insects that wandered across it in search of likelier foraging grounds. The old man lived out his days, and when he died, the house went to a great niece, who called it not the Old Dragon's House, but the Albatross, and put it on the market the moment it was certified as hers. That was when Michael's great-grandparents bought the place and turned it into the home that he grew up in. Normal Schwarzhelm had owned a chain of vaudeville theaters and had married his favorite headliner, Lolly Poppins. Just before vaudeville's collapse, Normal sold his theaters to a developer who was turning them all into movie houses, and then invested the money and retired to Mayfield, the smallest and most charming of the towns on his little circuit. Buying the Old Dragon's house was not Normal's idea, it was Lolly's. To her, it carried all the magic and romance of the legitimate stage to which she had always aspired. Her 20 years of doing slightly naughty comedic songs followed by tragic, tear-jerking ballads had never been more than a stopgap until she got her break. Her break turned out to be Normal, who adored her and indulged her and had a wagon load of money. Of course, he hadn't the power to get her into legitimate theater now. He was out of the business, and she was too old and too well known for her shtick, which was looking surprised and confused at the double entendres of her own songs, followed by a whooping laugh when she finally got her own joke. Nobody in legitimate theater would give her the roles she coveted. But the Dragon's house had a copious cellar, and with a little excavation and remodeling and an additional dose of heavy-duty wiring for the lights, she fitted out a little underground theater where she could mount amateur productions to her heart's content. Which she did. She became the producer, the director, and a beloved character actress with a lively community theater that did everything from the Trojan Women to Macbeth, the importance of being earnest, to the women. It should not be hard to guess which parts she played. She also brought in old friends from vaudeville to take part in the show, putting them up in her home and feeding them generously while they were there. a way to help out those in need without it looking like charity. You're doing me a favor, she would insist. These local amateurs need to see what a professional looks like. To fit all of her guests, she had workmen divide most of the bedrooms into small but cozy chambers, and as she did, she had the plumbing and wiring brought up to code so that, despite its age and the ancient look, the Dragon's house had all the modern amenities. When Lolly rehearsed and performed in the cellar, Normal climbed the stairs to the attic, where he too had a plethora of new wiring installed to support his passion, electric trains. The walls of the windowless room were lined with tables, and from the south wall a huge table projected into the middle, leaving only a narrow corridor. All of the tables were covered with train tracks, trestles, bridges, hills, villages, and cities, with the walls expertly painted as mountains, farmland, and on one side a river flowing out into the sea. Lolly invited all comers to the basement to watch her plays, but no one ever saw Normal's trains except the family, and then only a glimpse once in a while when they were calling him down to meals or to meet with his lawyer or his broker. His hobby was not for display. It was a world where he alone could lie. And over the years, his fantasy life in the attic became quite eccentric, for now and then he would come downstairs and remark, "The dragon was lively today," or "We had quite a thunderstorm in the attic," as if the train layout had its own weather and the occasional mystical beast to liven things up. "Next thing you'll tell us," Lolly would say, "the little tiny people will start packing their little tiny clothes in little tiny suitcases and buy teensy-weensy tickets so they can ride the train." He would look at her like she was crazy and say, "They're not real, Lolly." And she would just roll her eyes heavenward as if to ask God to judge which of them was mad. Lolly's first 3 children, fathered by her first 3 husbands, had been born during her vaudeville days and therefore loathed the theater, absolutely refusing to take part in her plays. But her 2 children by Normal, their son Herrick and their daughter Bernhardt, Harry and Hardy, had no bad memories of stage life, and so they happily threw themselves into every play. They were the princes murdered in the tower, they were Hansel and Gretel, they were young Ebenezer Scrooge and his beloved sister. When they weren't in rehearsal, they were romping among the costumes and the props and the old set pieces stored in the north side of the cellar. When Norma and Lolly died, no one minded that they left the house and all its contents to Harry and Hardy. After all, they were Normal's only children, and it was generous of him to leave a bit over $100,000 to each of Lolly's other 3 children. It was a lot of money in those days. Most of the money, though, went to Harry and Hardy, who kept up the tradition of theatricals in the basement until the city inspectors told them that the public safety laws had changed and there was absolutely no way to bring the cellar theater up to code without demolishing the whole building. It was a sad day when the old Dragon's house, when the public performances ended, and while they still had guests over and put on shows once in a while, the regular community theater moved to the local high school auditorium, and Harry and Hardy were no longer the heart and soul of it as they had once been. They still contributed financially from time to time, but by the 1970s, they had turned inward, not recluses, but focused on the life of their house. With all those bedrooms, but no more retired vaudevillians to sleep in them, and few plays to occupy their time, Harry and Hardy cast about for something useful to do. The idea that they hit upon was to take in strays. Well, stray children, that is. Runaways, abused children, orphans. They didn't take them all. No, by no means. They were actually quite selective, for they knew that only a few children would respond to what they had to offer, and why waste time and effort with those that they couldn't help? So they'd take a child in for a day or 2, and if things weren't working, they'd pass him or her along, bathed, fed, and with new clothes on their backs, to the social workers who would find them in ordinary sort of foster care. But there were always a few children, however, whose eyes lit up when they were given costumes to wear and lines to say, and now the occasional theatricals in the basement of Old Dragon's house were performed mostly by children and teenagers playing all the parts, with local kids joining in and the audience consisting mostly of parents and friends. The lost children thrived in this company. Most of them did well in school, and all of them went on to do well enough in life. For when you've been in a good play, and you know how to work together with others, do your own part well as you can, and trust others to do theirs, that's all you need to know in order to do fine in a job or a marriage. Hardy had never married, but stayed on in the house with Harry and his wife Celia. And when Celia died of breast cancer, Aunt Hardy became a surrogate mother to the 4 children and soon thought of them as her own. They were already teenagers, but before the transformation of the house to a theatrical orphanage. But they loved what their home had become, and they didn't mind that when they came home for a visit, there was rarely any place for them in the bedrooms. They might have slept on the big old bed in the front of the attic, but Hardy didn't really like to have people traipsing through her papa's train room to get to it. So they'd end up sleeping on couches here and there, and eventually, as their own families grew, at a nearby Holiday Inn. But Michael was not one of these grandchildren, who had always had homes of their own in faraway cities and came to Mayfield only to visit. Michael did call Harry and Hardy Gramps and Granny, but it wasn't true. They were actually his great-uncle and great-aunt. Michael's real mother was Portia Ringgold, Lolly's daughter by her third husband, a soldier who had died of the flu in World War I. Portia was killed by alcohol in her 50s, although technically the cause of death was falling in front of a subway train. And Michael's mother, Donna, was beaten to death by one of the uncles that came and went in her short, drug-addled life. Michael wasn't there for that sad day, however, for Harry and Hardy had gotten wind of what was happening in their niece's life and had offered to take care of Michael for a while so that Donna could recuperate. And that was why Michael had no memory of calling anyone mother. He only knew Gramps and Granny, and his only home was the little room in the back of the attic. They had put him there because, as Gramps said, well, the kids on the second floor come and go, but you're with us forever. And that's why Michael Ringgold grew up in the old Dragon House. At first, of course, he didn't know that's what the house was called. To him, it was simply home. That's what Gramps and Granny called it. I'm home. In our home, we have certain rules. We try to help these boys and girls feel at home. This is a home, not a gymnasium. He wasn't aware that other people's homes didn't have theaters in the basement, or sad, angry children coming and going from time to time on the second floor, or locked doors in the attic from which strange sounds emerged at odd hours of the night and day, or a warm place on the back of the stairs, where when he sat very still, he could feel the throb of a beating heart. He did know, however, that Granny didn't like him to sit in the warm place. Every time she saw him there, from earliest childhood, she would say, "What are you doing, boy? Why aren't you playing?" And then she would assign him some errand, or once he'd learned to read, make him get a book and read something aloud to her, which was nice. He was proud of being a reader. He didn't mind that. What he minded was the interruption. So, when he heard someone coming down the narrow hall towards the stairs that led to his attic room, he would scamper up to his bed and pretend to be sleeping. It never seemed to fool them. He tried pretending to just be waking up, but it was no good. "You were sitting there again, you dreamy, dreamy boy," said Granny. Or, "He was in that place again," one of the visiting kids would call out. Finally, when he was 4, one of the visitors took pity on him and told him how they knew. "It's a wooden staircase, you moron. They can hear your feet when you run up to your room." Oh. Michael learned then to take his shoes off when he went to sit in the warm place, and then, when he heard someone coming, he walked up the stairs very slowly, stepping only on the outside edges of the steps so that there were no creaks. It worked. Now the only time he was ever caught in the warm place was when he fell asleep there, and that hardly ever happened. Because even though it was, as Granny assumed, a place for dreaming, it wasn't sleeping dreams he went for. It wasn't because sleeping dreams were scarier. No, he had nightmares as frightening as some of his dreams when he was in the warm place. It was just that the dreams in the warm place always seemed to make sense. They didn't just go from one thing to another in the silly way that dreams did. They felt like memories, like he was thinking back on things that he'd done before. And whereas in sleeping dreams he always saw himself outside of himself, as if he were watching his own body from outside, in these memories he only felt himself. His own body stretching taut, exhilarating dreams of enormous strength, and yet being amazingly light and on fire inside all the time. Dreams of flying, dreams of falling down, hurtling towards the ground so fast that his vision went white, and he came to himself gasping as if he had just woken up. Only he knew at the end of one of those dreams that he had never been asleep, for through it all he remembered seeing the faded wallpaper and the part of the heavy curtained window that his eyes were focused on, even as he was moving through or over another world in another body. And he knew it was another body, because when he was walking around the house, toddling on his little legs and falling down or bumping into things, it was definitely not the body that he had in those dreams. In real life, he was not strong, and he could not fly, and he had never ever felt a fire inside. Maybe in a weaker child, this might have been an irresistible drug, to have those dreams in the warm place on the back stairs. But Michael Ringgold was strong without knowing it. Well, not strong of arm. He was as tough a kid as any, but no tougher, and no one would mistake him for a blacksmith's apprentice. His throw could get to first base, and he could chin himself up into a tree, but he didn't try for more. But there was another kind of strength that he had in good measure without knowing it. Michael loved dreaming that he could fly with the heat throbbing inside of him, but he also loved running around outside with the other kids, or lurking down in the theater to watch a play rehearsal, or helping paint scenery. He loved trying to steal cookie dough in the kitchen when Granny's back was turned. He even loved getting rapped on the head with a spoon as he made it out the door with his mouth full, while Granny shouted after him, "You'll get a disease from the eggs in the batter, you foolish boy!" Michael had his own strength to do what he chose to do, despite his own desires. One night, when he was 7, he heard the sound from behind the locked door. It was a sort of humming sound, with a bit of an edge to it. It sounded like Grandpa's electric razor, or a shower running somewhere else in the house. It wasn't quite dark yet, because it was summer. It was a summer night, and it was during daylight saving time. So even though there were shadows in the room, and he had never dared to get out of his bed when the sounds were there tonight, he decided that he had to know. And so, because he was so strong, he simply ignored his dread and got up. He only wore shoes for school and for church, but even though his feet had calluses from running across asphalt and climbing trees and scrambling through brambles, his soles felt extremely naked and vulnerable as he crossed the little space between his bed and the locked door that led deeper into the attic. He turned the handle. It turned freely, but he couldn't open the door. The sound didn't stop either. It was as if his little effort to pull the door open was not worth noticing. The keyhole was the old-fashioned kind, like the one on the door to the basement, but unlike the basement keyhole, this one seemed to have been plugged with something so that he couldn't see through it. Nor could he see anything under the door, which might mean that it was dark in the locked room, or it might mean that that, too, had some kind of obstruction to keep light from passing. So, all of his courage was wasted. He couldn't get through, and he couldn't see in. Only, he wanted to see, and this was the time. What did he have in his dresser drawer? Well, whatever he'd taken from his pockets all summer, stashed in the bottom drawer in a cigar box. He chose 2 items, the tarnished baby spoon that he'd found by the creek behind the house, and a cheap little pocket knife that he got by trading 4 fine marbles to one of the boys who hadn't stayed long at the house because he kept making fun of the other kids who were serious about rehearsing the play. It was Gramps' cut-down version of Macbeth, but the boy with the cheap knife never cared about it, even when he got assigned to play Banquo, which meant he got to be a ghost in the dinner scene. And then he was gone, and Michael suspected that he was the only person in the house that even remembered him now at the end of the summer, and that was only because he had this crummy little knife, and somewhere in the past few weeks it had gradually dawned on him that he had been cheated. Well, the knife wouldn't cut, and it wobbled in his hand, but maybe it could poke through whatever was blocking the keyhole. And it did. One punch straight through, and the blade broke and remained stuck in the keyhole. Great. Now when Granny came to clean up, she'd see the blade sticking out and know that he'd tried to break in. Only he hadn't, he just wanted to see. Well, no. If he'd been able to jimmy the lock, he would have opened the door. That was the truth, and if he couldn't tell the truth himself, then he really was a liar, like that one visiting girl had said he was, when Michael told her that he said his prayers every night, even when Granny and Gramps weren't watching over him to make him do it. I want to see in there, and I don't want to get caught for having tried. So he used the handle of the baby spoon. It was the best tool he had. Needle-nose pliers were what he needed, but just imagine trying to explain to Gramps what he needed them for. But the spoon handle did the job. By prying with it, he got the broken knife blade to wiggle and finally come loose. And now there was a hole, so tiny and narrow, thin as the blade, of course, that he couldn't actually see anything through it except for one thing. There was a light on in the room. bright light, dazzling light, and all the buzzing, whirring, rushing. What was in there? Why would Gramps and Granny leave a light on in the attic? There was a big attic window in the front of the house, and Michael had wondered for a long time whether the locked room ran the whole length of the house. But it wasn't the light of a dusky evening coming through the keyhole. It was like a very bright, naked bulb, 100-watt, like the one in the basement storage room that you turned on by pulling a chain that Michael could only reach by jumping. If there was always a light on in the locked room, it would have been visible from the front attic window. And if it were visible, there would have been plenty of overcast and stormy days when Michael had been outside, and he would have seen that the attic was lit. So, the locked room didn't have a window. It's my brother in there, thought Michael. My secret brother, who already lived here before they brought me. The crazy one who actually killed my mother, and they couldn't tell me about it because it was too terrible. He's chained in that room, only they don't know that he's broken the chain, and he's just waiting for me to open the door so he can grab me and tear out my throat with his teeth like a wolf. Or maybe it's my mother's body in there, like Snow White with the dwarves, laid out in a glass coffin to lie there looking beautiful until the prince comes to kiss her awake. Only the prince can't get in because the door's locked. Or maybe the attic crawl space would get him there. There was a low door in the wall at the foot of his bed that Granny said led into a crawl space. We don't store anything in there. It's just in case we get a dead rat or a bird's nest in there and we need to clean it out. So don't you go in there because the floor isn't finished and you'll put your foot right through the ceiling in the bedroom below and then we'll have to saw off your leg to get you out. She said it with her I'm pretending it's a joke but take heed look, and so, of course, he had tried to get in there the second her back was turned. But even though he could turn the primitive wooden latch easy enough, when he tried to push the door open, it jammed against something immediately, and he couldn't see in. Now, though, standing at the locked door, he looked out and looking over his bed, whose foot was jammed in under the slope of the roof, so that he sometimes bumped the ceiling with his feet when he turned over too quickly in bed. In that moment, perhaps because he actually wanted to know, he understood exactly why the door hadn't opened. It was bumping into the continued downward slope of the ceiling. The door didn't open into the crawl space, it opened into the room. And of course, that meant that to open it, Michael would have to move his bed. He had never tried to do that on purpose before. He had just done it accidentally before he learned how angry Granny would get if she caught him lying on his back in bed and shoving against the wall with the ceiling with his feet. If I wanted footprints on my ceiling, I would have moved to Australia, where they walk around upside down all the time. And then she had shoved his bed back into place with such vigor that the footboard on the bed had made 2 indentations in the ceiling, so the only real damage was what she had caused her own self. She didn't like it when Michael had pointed this out to her, and so he had learned a couple of lessons that day. How quietly could he pull the bed out from the little door? And how far would he have to pull it before he could get through? The answers were only a couple of slight scraping sounds and about 1.5 feet. He was sweating from the exertion of pulling the bed when he stuck his head through the opening and looked around. It was very, very dark. But the longer he leaned in there, his body half in, half out of the crawl space, the better he could see. There was light coming up from the outer edges of the room. Faint light, because it really was full dusk outside, and soon there would be no light at all. He could see the rafters like corduroy, row on row, with thick dust piled on them like snow on a fence rail. He thought of falling down through the ceiling. He thought of getting halfway there and realizing it was too dark to go on, and then having it be so dark that he couldn't find the door to get back to his room. And then he'd feel a hand on his shoulder and a voice would say, "Hello, little brother." And when he thought of that, there was no way he was going in. Not tonight. Tomorrow, when it was light, and when the noises weren't coming from the locked room. He pulled himself back into his room. There was one horrible moment when his belt loop on his jeans snagged against the door frame, and he thought something had grabbed him. But then he was through the door, and he slammed it shut, fortunately not making much noise because it was such a thin door, and it didn't really have a jamb to bump against. And then he scrambled to his feet, got around to the head of the bed, and shoved it against the wall. Well, now nothing could get through the door without moving his bed, and that would wake him up, so it was safe. Besides, he'd slept in this room all his life, and nothing had ever come out that little crawl space door to get him, had it? So why was he lying here under his covers, constantly lifting up his head to see if the door had moved? It had! Oh no, it hadn't. But maybe it had. And then, when he woke up in the morning and didn't even remember about the crawl space until he was in the front yard, enjoying one of the last days of summer before second grade. He looked up at the front of the house and saw the attic balcony and window and wondered, as he sometimes did, whether his secret brother ever looked out the window at him playing and hated him. And that was when he remembered the crawl space last night. Only, had that really happened? Wasn't it just a dream? Well, today he'd go in while it was daylight and settle the question once and for all. But he forgot about it again. He forgot it over and over, except whenever he was too far away or too busy with something to bother running upstairs and do the experiment. He kept not doing it until he was away at school every day, and then he really did forget. And then one of the visiting kids told him that all houses make weird noises at night. It's just the wind coming out of the toilet drain pipes, the girl said. That and the house settling down to rest at night. And now that he thought about it, Michael realized that toilet drain pipes probably all made sounds like that from the wind whistling over them. So it wasn't really coming out of the locked room at all. It was just the pipes. And that was that. Mystery solved. Of course it wasn't his brother. He had no brother. That was just a nightmare. And one night, halfway through second grade, Gramps looked at him and said, "How tall are you now, boy?" "Tall enough to pee standing up, but not tall enough to shave." The visiting kids at the dinner table laughed and snorted. "I hate it that you taught him to say that," said Granny. "I didn't," said Gramps. "It's just the simple truth." "It's so crude to use words like that." "You heard your Granny, Michael. We have to call it chin depletion, not shaving." "I'm this tall," said Michael, standing up beside his chair like he did during Grace. "That's what I thought," said Gramps. "Birds' nests are in grave danger of you from now on, young man. You'll soon have to duck going under bridges." "I'll just step over them," said Michael. "You're not that tall," said one of the kids, a serious boy with a round scar on his arm. "It's a brag," said an older girl. "They always brag." "It's a joke," said another girl. "Nay," said Granny, "it's a jest, a jape," which was the cue for Gramps to do his gorilla act, saying, "I beat on my jest 'cause I am one of the great japes." Only when he had finished and Granny had spooned him on the butt and he had fled back to his chair did he finally come to his point. "Well, we have an empty room on the second floor," said Gramps. "I think you're too tall for that little bed in the attic now." "I like it fine, Gramps," said Michael. "Yeah, he lives up there with his pet chicken," said one of the older boys. Another boy immediately made a choking sound. Gramps glared at them both, and they wilted a little, so Michael knew that there was something bad or dirty about what they had said, but for the life of him, he could not figure out what it was. Gramps and Granny didn't do anything about it for a few weeks, but then one day, when Michael came home from school, he found that his stuff had been moved down into the little bedroom right at the foot of the back attic stairs, directly beneath his old attic room. It broke his heart, but he tried to hide it. And he must have done pretty well, because it wasn't till he was crying alone in his bed that he heard Granny's voice saying, "Good heavens, Michael! Why are you crying?" But he couldn't answer. He just clung on to her for a long while, until he wasn't crying anymore. "I'm okay," he said. "But whatever were you crying about?" "It's okay," he insisted. "It's not okay, and if you don't answer me right now, I'm going to go downstairs to my room and cry until you come down, and then when you ask why I'm crying, I won't tell you either." I just guess I'm one of the visiting kids now, that's all," said Michael. "I don't really mind." What? That's absurd, you silly frumpus. Why would you think that?" "Well, 'cause Gramps said, when I moved in, that the kids on the second floor come and go." "Oh, no. Oh, you poor boy. You remember that? You weren't even 3. How could you remember?" "Oh, but don't you see, he was trying to reassure you, because we thought that you might think being up in the attic meant that we didn't love you as much as the other kids. But the fact was that the bed up there is a child's bed, and you're the only person who could sleep in it, and it was the only space we had for you then. Gramps moved you down here because you're bigger, that's all. But you're not going to come and go, Michael. You're your very own. You're our last little boy of our very own." "I'm not your own," he said. "You're not even my granny. You're my aunt." I'm your great-aunt, and don't you forget. Only we shortened that to Grant, and then to Granty, and then to Granny, only that just sounds so theatrical and phony that we changed it to Granny. So don't you see, I'm your granny because I'm your great-aunt. And I suppose Gramps is short for great-uncle? No, not at all. It's because he's grumpy. We called him Grumps when he was a boy, and it stuck, only somehow over the years it changed to Gramps. So what is my name going to change to over the years? I have no idea, said Granny, but won't it be interesting to see over the years? Because you are going to be here for years and years, as long as you like, until the day comes when you want to leave, to go off to college or get married to some nice girl. I'm not supposed to say P and then you can talk about me marrying some girl? Hardly seems fair, does it? And then he didn't feel like crying anymore, and after a while, he kind of liked being on the same floor as the visiting kids, and some of them even became his friends, because they were almost his age. And now and then, he still went halfway up the back stairs to the warm place. But after the few weeks, he didn't bother to go all the way up to his old room. I mean, it wasn't his room anymore, was it? And down here, he never heard the sound of the wind rushing past the toilet drain pipes. He almost forgot about it. For years, he almost forgot. 7th grade. It was the year that Granny and Gramps put on Our Town, As You Like It, and Tom Sawyer. The year that Michael Ringgold changed from the clarinet to the French horn because the junior high band had 14 clarinets and no French horn player at all. And the year that everyone was Indiana Jones for Halloween, so Michael and Gramps worked up for a week to put together a costume so that he could go trick-or-treating as the Lost Ark. It was the year that there was such a blizzard on the day after Christmas that the whole town of Mayfield shut down. The snow was no burden at all on the old Dragon's house, of course, because they had a troop of boys and girls on hand and plenty of snow shovels to go around. So the front yards and sidewalk were soon clear right down to the cobbles and bricks. The kids were enthusiastic about the labor, too, because they carried the snow to the backyard in wheelbarrows and soon made such a mountain of snow that they could slide down it in all directions on sleds, inner tubes, and the seat of their pants. It was great fun, and no one broke any bones this time. So the worst injury was probably the cut Michael got on his hand when his sled collided with another kid's snow shovel. He didn't mind. It was cold enough that his hands were too numb for the pain to be more than a dull throb. But the other kids started to complain that his blood was turning the snow all pink, and it looked gross. So we went inside, and Granny almost fainted. In a few minutes she had methrolate poured over the wound and was stitching it up herself, a skill that she'd learned from her mother, who had done her fair share of backstage doctoring during the vaudeville days. Now hold still so I can line up the edges of the wound so that the skin matches up. Otherwise you'll look rumpled. Will I have a scar? Said Michael. Yes, you will, and I hope you're not contemplating a life of crime because it'll make your palm print absolutely distinctive. I wish it was on my face, said Michael. I wish it were on my face, corrected Granny. And why would you ever wish for such a foolish thing? Well, scars are romantic. Romantic. Maybe once upon a time and dueling scars were romantic, but sledding scars are definitely not. So I hope you're not going to go out there and lie down and mount snow shovel and let the sleds run over you. I never would have thought of it if you hadn't suggested it. She finished covering his palm with a bandage and winding around it with tape. All packaged up so nicely, we ought to put a stamp on it and mail it somewhere. Oh, come on, this bandage is so thick I can't even pick my nose. Well, if you expect me to do it for you, you can think again. So, are you going to help me get on some mittens? Apparently, you are suffering from the illusion that you are going back outside to open up this wound after I went through all the trouble to stitch it close. That was my plan, Gran. My plan is for you to stay here in the kitchen till you warm up. And whose plan do you think will prevail? How about I go lie down in my room? Well, that will certainly do, although I must warn you that if I look back out and see you on Mount Snow Shovel again, you will have a nice new set of scars on your squatting zone, and I will stitch some all skew-wampus so that everyone who sees your backside will laugh at you. Who's ever going to see my backside? Never you mind who. I can just promise you that you won't want them laughing. I won't go back outside again, he said. Not even just to watch? Said Granny. Not even just to watch, said Michael. And he meant it, because now that he was warmer, he really could feel the pain in his hand, and it was nasty, a deep, hard throb that made it difficult to think about anything else. Well, if you're going up to bed, let me give you some cough medicine. I don't have a cough, Granny. The cough medicine has codeine in it, said Granny. That's how it cures coughs. You fall asleep. So he waited while she spooned the oversweet stuff into his mouth. He remembered that when he was little, he liked it, but now it was too sweet. It made him want to brush his teeth. So up to his room he went, and feeling a little lightheaded by the time he got to the top of the stairs. When he flopped down on the bed, the sudden move made his hands throb so hard that he almost fainted from pain. He lay there wincing and panting for what seemed like forever, refusing to cry. He finally worked up the gumption to get up and find a comic book to read, but the light coming into the room wasn't bright enough to read well, and he didn't want to turn the overhead light on because it was too bright, so in the end he fell asleep with the comic book on his chest. When he woke up, he was lying on the comic book, and his hand hurt worse, but differently. Deep healing rather than the harsh pain of injury. It was still light in the window, but it was the dim light of a winter evening, and he could hear the sound of dinner being eaten downstairs. He must have slept for hours, and he was hungry. Pain or no pain, he had missed lunch, and he wasn't going to miss dinner too. He swung his feet over the edge of the bed, stood up, and then sat right back down, his head swimming. He had apparently lost a lot of blood outside in the snow, but after a few more minutes sitting on the edge of the bed, he was able to stand up and walk rather feebly towards the door, leaning on things as he went. In the doorway, though, he heard sudden yells of laughter from downstairs, and suddenly he wasn't hungry at all, or at least not so hungry that he wanted to walk into the bright, crowded kitchen with all the kids gathering around the table. Granny would make a fuss over him, but the other kids would mock him and tease him, and it just made him tired. He wanted to be alone, like an injured animal crawls off into the deepest thicket of woods in order to either bleed to death or heal. He might have turned back to his own room, but that wasn't where he wanted to go. Without naming his goal, he walked along the narrow hall to the back of the house, and then slowly climbed the stairs to the warm place. He hadn't spent much time there this year. No, perhaps none. Perhaps he hadn't sat in this place since 6th grade or 5th. He didn't remember. He only knew that this was the sheltered place where he needed to go when he felt like he felt right now. He sat down on the step where he had always sat, but now he was bigger and his body didn't fit into the place it used to. It had been a really long time, and he was going through a growth spurt, Granny said, and his legs were so long they stuck out at the bottom of his pants like popsicle sticks. He did not close his eyes because he never closed his eyes here. Instead, he let his gaze rest idly and unfocused on the wallpaper near the back stairs window, and let the warmth of the place seep into him. It came to him as it always did, in gentle increments, which each throb of the heartbeat of the place. This time, though, the throbbing of the pain in his hand had its own rhythm that conflicted with the slower beat of the warm place, and it made him feel agitated at first, jumpy, restless. But then the warmth went to his hand and for a moment actually burned, as if he had just thrust his whole hand into a blazing fire, and he cried out with the sharpness of it. But then he was caught up in a dream. Not of flying this time, no. He felt himself sliding and slithering through a dark passage of cold stone, downward mostly, but he couldn't really see anything except shadows against a dull red glow that seemed to increase with each of his breaths and quickly fade. He would brush against the side of the roof for the passage and feel a chill against his crusty skin, but the chill could never get very deep because he had so much warmth inside him. The cool cavern rock opened up, and he was in a large open cavern with stalactites and stalagmites, and a different sort of glow, a deeper red. The air here was very hot as the pain in Michael's palm, and so there was a sort of balance, and it didn't bother him so much. It was just part of the place. He slipped among the stalagmites, feeling his body trailing among them, bending easily around them, scraping on both sides, but never injured. He had never realized how long his body was when he was in the dreams of this place, or how tight and smoothly his arms could press up against his sides. The underground chamber grew larger and brighter the farther they went in, and the stalagmites soon ceased. Instead, the floor beneath his feet, under his belly, was a bumpy and yet as smooth as the surface of boiling water. If you could harden boiled water, that was. He came at last to the shore of an underground sea, only the sea was made of molten stone, seething and bubbling and smelling of sulfur. The blast of heat from the sea was worse than standing in front of Granny's oven when she really heated up to broil something. And yet, instead of making him want to back away, to retreat to some cool place, it seemed to waken a fire inside of him, and he wanted to be inside it the way he wanted to plunge into a swimming pool on a hot August day. Not that the sea of molten stone would be cool, but rather that the intense heat of it would bring his body the same kind of relief. This body. What am I when I dream like this? Not this boy, this weak, walking boy clad in soft, easily sliced skin, not this cowering creature who slinks through the world, creeping up back stairs and hiding from the laughter of his enemies. Enemies? I have no enemies. None who dare show themselves, little huddling human. Who are you? I am the fire. And with that thought, the body Michael wore in his dreams leapt up and spread its arms, its thin, strong wings, and rose circling high above the sea of magma until he could sense, with senses he didn't know he had, the roof of the great cavern, the crown of this bubble of deep air within the earth. And having reached the zenith of this dark sky, he plunged down, straight down into the hot sea, and his mind turned white inside, and Michael unconsciously sprawled upon the stairs. He became aware of himself again, stretched out across the steps, long and sinuous, his sleek, feathery scales unperturbed by the wooden edges. His wings were folded up under him, and his great jaws began to yawn. Well, no. That would be the other body, not this one. He stretched, and it was the arms of a boy that stretched, the hands of a boy that flexed, the eyes of a boy that opened. It was dark, but it had been nearly dark when he had first crept into the place, so that didn't tell him how long he had been asleep. It couldn't have been long, because Granny would have checked on him when the other boys finished dinner, and not finding him in his room, she would have looked first in this place. He rose to his feet and was surprised at how small and light he was. An hour ago he would have thought himself rather tall and big. His man height was coming on these days, and he was taller than Granny, wasn't he, and almost as tall as Gramps? He looked down at his hands that were not wings, and again he flexed his fingers and realized that the bandaged hand didn't hurt at all. Not so much as a twinge. The only discomfort was from the awkwardness of the thick bandage. He brought the bandage up to his mouth to bite at the tape, but then he remembered that he had another hand, and used those fingers to pry the end of the tape and peel it away. Granny's thorough packaging was unwrapped in only a few moments, and underneath it, there was no wound at all, not even a scar. Only a few loops of black thread lying in his palm. He blew them away, and there was no way to tell which hand had been sliced. Was this what happened when he plunged into the sea of fire? It made him whole? You healed me? But there was no answering thought as there had been in the dream, just a faint buzzing, whirring, rushing sound, which Michael now knew with absolute certainty was not the sound of wind rushing past the standpipes and playing them like an organ. It came from inside the locked windowless room, where a bright bulb shone through, even though no one ever entered to change the bulb. It sounded like razors, like can openers, and he had to know, had to see. He was up the stairs in a moment, his eye trying to peer through the keyhole. The tiny slit he had made years ago was still there, and as before, it showed only dazzling light. In moments, he had the bed back from the crawlspace door and was through it. It was dark, but he felt his way along the rafters, taking care to find the next one before taking his weight from the one before. If there were spider webs or beetles, he didn't care. He was barely aware of the thick dust that rose from the rafters with each movement of his hand or foot. For one moment, he thought he would sneeze, but he held it in by holding his breath, for he did not want to set the house on fire. Fire? I make no fire when I sneeze. Who are you? Who healed me? Whose body is it that I dwell in? Who took me diving into fire? There was a faint light up ahead. Far ahead, the length of the house. It was a couple of lines of dim light, and when at last he got there, he found that it was another crawlspace door, which was closed only by the same simple latch as the door in the old attic room. He lifted the block of wood, and the door easily opened at his push. He was in the front room of the attic, the one that had the window and the balcony overlooking the street. The only light in this room came from the street lights outside. That had been enough to make a faint glow around the edges of the crawlspace door. But he could still hear the noise from the locked room, and there, opposite the window, was another door. This keyhole had not been blocked up, and a bright glow shone plainly through it. And when Michael turned the handle and pulled, the door opened easily. 4 bright naked bulbs and ceiling fixtures made the dazzling light, and the razor sound had come from 5 electric trains, making rounds along tracks that stretched completely around the room. The table surrounding the room crossed even in front of the door, so that the only way into the room was to duck under the table and come up on the other side, in the midst of a miniature world of villagers, train stations, trestles, and tunnels, hills and farms and rivers and a distant sea. Who had built this? Why didn't anyone ever see it? Why did they leave the trains running, with no one here to play with them? In the corner of the room, a mist seemed to gather. Michael watched it, fascinated. It was a cloud. He saw that now, emanating from the smokestacks of a tiny factory. No sooner had it formed than electricity began to spark from it. Michael felt his own hair stand on end the way it did when you rubbed a balloon and held it near. The sparks crackled. A tiny bolt of lightning snapped from the cloud to a train track. There was a sharp cracking sound, miniature thunder. He could smell the ozone. How was it done? He had never heard of a train layout with weather. A storm, of all things. No rain, but maybe that was coming. The cloud kept jetting out of the smokestacks, and now the whole ceiling was masked by it, so that the light of the bulbs was dimmed. Lightning cracked here and there all around the room, snapping down to the tracks. Each time the trains hesitated for a moment, but then went on. Michael caught a whir of motion out of the corner of his eyes. He spun to look. A train? But the only train in that part of the room was nowhere near the motion he had seen. He looked intently at the painted, lichened landscape, and again saw movement as a dragonfly suddenly leapt towards the ground near the mouth of the tunnel. It flew rapidly across the room, so Michael could hardly get a look at it. There was something wrong, though. It didn't move like a dragonfly, really. It had the long tail, but the wings weren't a dragonfly's blur of translucence. They flapped like birds' wings. And yet the skin of the tiny creature was iridescent like a dragonfly's body, sparkling in the light, glimmering with each thread of lightning. And the creature did not shy away from the lightning either. In fact, it seemed drawn to it, darting towards each bolt as if it were drinking in the ozone that was left behind in the burnt air. I know you, thought Michael. I know you, he whispered. You don't know me, came the answer in his mind. You will never know me. You are incapable of knowing me, you poor worm. You healed my hand. You took me flying with you and plunged me with you into the magma deep within the earth. Thank you, Michael whispered. In reply, the tiny dragon lunged into the air just as a spark of lightning began to crackle downward, and even though it happened in a mere instant, Michael thought he saw the dragon sparkle all over as if the lightning were inside it, and it was the dragon that snapped toward the electric track, leaving a trail of lightning behind it. And then it was gone. The lights went out. The trains fell silent. Michael was in total darkness, surrounded by silence and the smell of ozone and another faint burnt smell. You couldn't have died, thought Michael. After all these years that the trains have run in this room and the lightning flashed, you couldn't have died on the very day when I first came here and saw you. It must be this way every time. You were reaching for the lightning. You must have reached for it, caught it like a surfer catching a wave, and ridden it down to earth. You must still be here, somewhere. And you are not really as small as the dragon I saw in this room. In all of my dreams, the one thing I never felt was that you were small. There was no answering thought, only the gradually increasing light as Michael's eyes became accustomed to seeing, and the faint spill from the streetlights outside the window in the front attic room. Who built this room? There had been some mention now that Michael thought of it, of Gramps and Granny's father having electric trains. Was it him then? Yet, how did he ever get a dragon to come here? He couldn't have made it. No man could make a living thing, and the dragon was already alive, but it came here into the house, and it's lived here all my life. I had the bedroom next to it. When I peered through that tiny slit in the keyhole, I was looking for the dragon. And when I sat in the warm place, I felt the beating of its huge, invisible heart. I felt it come to life, its life come over me like a dream. I dwelt in its memories. It healed my hand. What am I to this creature? A pet? A friend? A servant? A son? Its future prey? Michael ducked under the table and left the train room, closing the door behind him. He made his way back through the crawl space and emerged again in the bedroom of his childhood. He went downstairs into the room that he'd been sleeping in and took all the sheets and blankets off his bed and carried them back up the stairs to his old room. He knew he couldn't sleep on the child's bed there, so he spread them out on the floor. He went back down and gathered all of his other things. Not much, really. Just clothing and his school books and a few toys and games and tools. It only took 3 trips, and he had moved upstairs again. Only then did he hear the noise of kids bounding up the stairs to the second floor, the water running in the bathrooms, a lot of chatter and laughter, and a few complaints and whines. And now he remembered there had been a dress rehearsal of New Year's play As You Like It. They must have covered for him. He had a couple of smallish parts, being too young to compete for the leads in a grown-up play. Granny must have thought he was sleeping and didn't let anyone wake him. But now the rehearsal was over and everyone was going to bed, and Granny would come looking for him to see if he was hungry and to check on his hand. He went to the head of the back stairs and started down just as Granny was starting up. She looked down at the remains of the bandage lying on the steps. "Oh, why did you take it off? That was foolish." "It's all better," said Michael. "Don't be absurd," said Granny. "It takes days for wounds to fully close, even with stitches." She held out her hand. "Let me see the damage." So he went down a few more steps, and she came up a few, and he held out his hand to her. "Don't be a goof, Michael. Show me the hand that you cut." "This is the hand," he said, showing her the other as well. She held both his hands, palms up in hers, and looked from one to the other and then up into Michael's eyes. "What were you doing here?" "I moved back into my old room. I want to live in my old room again." "The bed's too small. I'll sleep on the floor." "What happened to your hand, Michael?" "Well, I guess it wasn't as serious as you thought," he said. "Don't be absurd. I should know how deep it was. And even if it was only a scratch, it wouldn't be healed like this." "What did you do?" "I came up to the warm place on the stairs," he said, "and I slept." She looked in his eyes, and perhaps she could see that he wasn't lying, or perhaps she could see something else, something that forbade her to inquire more. Maybe she could see the dragon's eyes, just a glimpse of the dragon's eyes looking out at her. "I never came up here," she said softly. "After I was a little girl and Mother sent me to fetch Father for dinner, and I knocked on the door of his train room, and he didn't hear me, so I opened it." "What did you see?" said Michael. "What did you see?" she asked him in reply. "Trains," he said. "And lightning." She shuddered. "What did Papa do in there, Michael?" "I don't know," he said. "He must have been very talented with electric things. He was just an ordinary man, rich, of course, theatrical. He owned a lot of playhouses back in the vaudeville days, but none of that should have let him create." "Weather," said Michael. "You went inside," she said. "It would be easier," said Michael, "if you gave me a key. I won't tell the other kids. I won't let anyone in. But now that I've seen it, you can't keep me out." "It's dangerous," she said. "So is crossing the street." "That is an unbelievably inept analogy, Michael." "I won't die in that room." "Papa was only truly alive there," she said. "There were weeks when he hardly came out, and when he did, it was as though he was living in a dream. as though we weren't real. Only the train room was real. I know what's real, said Michael. I'll talk to Harry, she said, to Gramps. I love you, Granny, said Michael. Because you think I'll give you what you want? Because you're good, he said. If I were really good, she said, I would move out of this house and take you with me and never let you come back here again. If I really loved you, I'd come back, he said. I grew up in the dragon's heart. Tears came to her eyes. Papa talked about dragons. It was part of his... He wasn't crazy, said Michael. They live in the fire. The fires under the earth are like home to them. And they fly the lightning. They soar into the storm. And they search for the lightning. And when they catch it, they just ride it back down to earth. Don't tell me any more, she said. You can't have inherited his madness. None of Papa's blood is in your veins. It's not madness. It's the house that does it. Letting you sleep in the attic. I should never have done that. He came to the house because he loves the lightning, and there's so much electricity here. In the theater lights in the basement, and up here in the tracks and the trains. That's all. It's not madness, it's real. He came out of the earth because all the electricity called to him. How do you know that? Because I felt how he hungers for it. I felt it too, and that's what called me into the train room. That's what drew me. I know it now. He's all throughout the house. It didn't matter where you had me sleep. Once I felt his heartbeat here on the back stairs, I knew him, Granny. And when was that? She asked softly. The first day I was here, when you and Gramps took me up these stairs and told me that I would live here forever. I felt his heartbeat when we climbed the stairs. That's how I knew I was truly at home. Because it was warm there, and I'd never been warm like that before. Why didn't you tell me what was happening to you? I didn't know it myself until today, until I said it out loud to you, just now. He bent down, for he was standing 2 steps above her, and kissed her forehead. I love you, Granny. I'll be safe. I'll be careful. Don't be afraid for me. Look. He held his hands out. He healed my hand. That really happened. He's looking out for me. But even as he said it, he knew it was not true. Dragons don't look out for human beings. Dragons don't care. She pressed his hand to her cheeks. Oh, God help us, Michael. To which he had no answer. If God helps us, he thought, he does it through other people. It was you and Gramps who took me in when I needed a home, but maybe it was God who made you my great-aunt and great-uncle. It was the dragon who healed my hand, but maybe it was God who brought me to the house where the dragon lives. I'm hungry, said Michael. Is there any dinner left? Yes, she said, coming to herself. Yes, of course. I kept some of it warm in the oven for you. Shepherd's pie. Nasty stuff, said Michael, sliding past her and putting his arm around her, walking down the stairs. I don't know why you work so hard to poison us with stuff like that. I saved you half a pie because I know how you love it, she said. Only half when I didn't have lunch? What were you thinking? Don't get smart with me. You want me to get stupid? I can do that. No, you can't, she said. It takes real brains to do that. It was an old joke between them, but it felt more meaningful now. Almost portentous. But then, anything they said would sound that way now that they knew each other's secrets. Well, some of them anyway. The dragon gargoyle on the house at 22 Adams poured water out of its mouth when it rains and splashed it on the cobblestones of the garden, and in a bad storm it can soak the shoes of whoever is standing at the door. The house is so unusual, Gothic and mid-Victorians, the garden cobbled and bricked, and a torrent of boys and girls running in and out of the house at all hours, that people drive from all over town sometimes just to see the old dragon house. None of them guessed that every night in the back room of the attic, the old dragon watches over the sleeping boy whose body is growing into one that someday he can use, someday he can wear, allowing him to emerge from the wiring of the house and bear a living body up into the sky, soaring once again on gossamer wings, his whirrum tail curling under him, seeking lightning in the storm so that he can ride back down to earth. One ride per body, alas. for it burns up on the ride and shatters against the earth as the dragon within it plunges down into the earth. But then, one ride on a single bolt of lightning is enough to keep a dragon going for thousands of years. And the boy would love the moment when he came. They always did.